What if? What if everybody knew that a theatre is like a sanctuary, a space to better understand our society and how it came to be like this? A place to imagine how it could be better, a place to meet and talk with strangers and change the course of lives. Kat.
What if we take a bunch of participating artists and a bunch of venue labourers, and we had a week-long camping trip, and we cooked together, we did the washing up, we harvested the plants, we imagined the future, we went hunting together. What if?
Yeah, what if? What if we all made more time for art? That's just in response to what Kat was saying. I wrote, what if we made a commitment to helping other artists? It might be a retweet or a message of care, offering support, an ear, looking over an application, a place to stay. Kat said this morning that she was going to travel over to the Lowry to see the Joe Bannon show and stay over. She could have stayed with me. But these small acts of kindness from one artist to another, but it has to go beyond a hashtag. How many private acts of allyship can you do? Not just the public ones. How many private acts of allyship can you commit to doing?
Rich are getting richer, poor are getting poorer. Nothing's been done to make it any better. Ismism is all what we talk about. Ismism is all what we say. What if we were a little bit more kinder, a little bit more respectful, a little bit more like this, but actually can touch and feel and hug?
What if all arts organisations had a care manifesto that was created by everybody who was involved in them and people who weren't? And what if that manifesto was not like some dusty old document shoved in the back of a cupboard somewhere? What if that was like a living, lively document that was like danced and BSL'd and sung, and you could record it and you could play it around the venue, and you could create art about it and sort of weave it into the fabric of everything that happens in that organisation?
What if the first thing that artists and organisations did at the beginning of a relationship was to create a care document together? What if there wasn't one big document, but lots of little documents that are lived and contributed to and signed, and a commitment between the artist and the venue or the organisation that care comes first, before the art, before product, before selling anything, marketing anything? What if the commitment to well-being was before any conversation about what it is that we produce?
What if I could earn my money and not ask for it? What if the people who worked in arts buildings were called caretakers? What if everyone had a mentor and everyone was a mentor? What if we worked slowly and consciously without depleting our energy? What if I don't start anything but I join something? What if I remove the title artist altogether, understand myself as a really invested and curious person who can stand up in front of a lot of people if necessary, and in a costume if necessary, and have a compulsion to feed people? And what if that was enough? What if anger was understood as completely rational? What if precarity was not the accepted or expected circumstance of anyone? What if we understood that when things are risky, it's because value is being redistributed? What if art was untethered? What if art was untethered?
What if fields were part of an NPO's obligation, a part of their deal? Salaried artists paid to do exactly this, and reports that had to be actioned. It would also therefore give a network around the country, around the world, of fields sharing skills, knowledge and resources, and a ready-made, more sustainable touring package.
The future of live performance will be responsive, necessary, and grounded in presence. It will be seen as violent, disruptive, and excessive. There'll be a reconsideration of art as ritual, use of magical practices, frames, and metaphors, a decolonizing of pedagogical spaces, a divestment from tainted money, the development of compassionate, generous platforms and support structures. The future of live work is rooted in action, activism, collaboration, healing, and resistance, staring the future and the past in the face, which means our survival. No more bullshit white middle class craft fairs. We need work grounded in hope, well-being, optimism, and compassion. Work that responds to ethical problems coming from science, technology, the environment, and the changing definitions of self. The future is vegan, with Indigenous, BAME, queer, trans, crip, elderly, migrant voices to the front. The future is sustainable, accessible, and has a global outlook.
What if, together, we could find a way to make the arts have equal standing and emphasis in education as STEM subjects?
What if art centres had community gardens? What if art centres had swimming pools, creches, libraries, soft play areas, cheap cafes? What if they were truly, truly accessible? What if all venues had to be carbon neutral? What if young people got to programme shows? What if schools got to go to shows for free every single month? What if every venue has a residency house and a sauna?
What if we insist on a new precedent, mandatory consideration of the ecological impact of art making by artists, venues, and producers, to implement appropriate actions to mitigate against contributing to the crisis, to raise, develop transparency, communication, advocacy around eco-considered practice as normal procedure, and consciously enhancing the role and responsibility of artists to include stewardship of the planet. What if What if we retain a commitment to networks of artists from multiple disciplines, such as this gorgeous cohort? What if we insist that the history of UK colonisation and imperialism is a mandatory pillar of education? What if arts went back centrally to education in this country? What if we were less discrediting of mainstream work in favour of marginal work, experimental work practice, or the same in reverse? Everything is connected. It is a continuum. What might new bridges look like? And what if, foundationally, we saw art making as love in action?
What if we moved away from the idea of venues altogether What if there was a database of all of the abandoned and unused and derelict spaces, and we could just go and make work in them? What if money was given to process rather than to outcome? What if there was universal basic income so we could make work that wasn't just to make money? What if there was a space, a whole network of spaces run by and programmed by artists who know what it is to not get paid on time, to do shows on an unfair split, and to not be listened to, and how we could rectify all of that? What if burnout wasn't celebrated? What if the space between work was seen as just as important, if not more so, than the work itself? And what if all of this was central to what is taught to anyone trying to enter the arts?
What if venues were just collections of people who could leave the buildings to meet new audiences and artists in their spaces, in parks and lay-bys and two-man tents? And if those people then asked questions about what's needed and then invited us back to theirs?
What if theatre was free to everyone, like an art gallery? What if we gave people the drinks as bribes to stay and talk about what they've watched? Cat.
What if each year different venues around the UK, but let's just start with the north. So what if each year venues in the north gave 3 weekends for 3 independent artists to curate a mini festival? And that mini festival will be entirely curated by them without any venue programming input. It will be a celebration of their peers and the themes they feel passionate about.
What if students were prepped for industry in terms of care, self-care, prioritising their needs, to learn to carve out a space to think, a space to feel? What if we taught listening as well as building a voice?
What if artists of colour and disabled artists are not called radical anymore, and it's just normal?
What if we could make the work that we deeply, desperately need to make instead of the work that we thought we might get funded?
What if figures were transparent and that was mandatory? What if budgets and salaries and fees were things that everyone in the team looked at rather than one person? What if there was standardized fees? What if we start to rethink what competition means? What if we eradicate competition entirely?
What if you came to my house, my actual house, and then what if I came to yours? What if we weren't scared? What if artists were employed with a contract with no end date and then they retired with a pension? What if we boycott what is unethical properly?
What if, when I was scared, there were people to give me a hug, and when you were scared, I was able to give you a hug? What if making work and a venue was completely and utterly illegal, not jittering around the sides as it is at the moment, and special? What if making work and venues without access was completely and utterly illegal?
What if boards, management, and the arts generally were truly reflective of the makeup of society? What if every art space and institution was accessible by design? What if you could nap or sleep in art spaces without getting told to buy something or leave? And what if men were encouraged to feel and cry from a young age?
What if we could speak as one very loud voice to shape policy and lead the conversation in the UK?
What if more work took place in parks, tower blocks, multi-storey car parks, residential streets, and beaches? What if staff earned equal or means-tested salaries? What if staff and venues were non-hierarchical? What if every free space in a venue is offered for free all of the time and is filled all of the time? What if performances came with free snacks?
What if we were able to address the ratio with which venues champion visiting artists rather than those who live locally? What if it was easier to be a hero in your own town? What if it was easier to make work where we live? And what if we had test and trace?
What if going into the arts was seen as a viable career option or as something that you legitimately want to do with your life? What if wanting to be a theatre maker wasn't seen as a waste of talents and wasn't told to kids and teenagers and young adults that they'd probably better find a real thing to do? What if it wasn't seen as a pipe dream? What if you didn't have to be noticed? What if, in order to make work, people from marginalised communities didn't have to mind their trauma to feel like they can get programmed somewhere?
What if venues could tell us we're valued to our faces, not just on their evaluation forms afterwards? And what if venues could help artists to step off the application treadmill with kindness?
What if audiences could really trust the programming? What if those audiences came to see unfamiliar work and unfamiliar artists with curious enthusiasm?
What if I saw, oh my God, I'm getting slightly emotional about this one. What if I saw myself represented on stage a little more from fellow first-generation migrants from Eastern Europe? And I'm just going to list out some countries here which are in that Eastern European bloc. Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Albania, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Slovenia, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, which incidentally is the biggest migrant community in Scotland, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And if you want to throw in all of the Russian Federation.
What if an artist could sustain themselves through making art alone? What if they didn't have to do other jobs, bar jobs, teaching jobs? What if they could create without the pressure of thinking, will this work sell? Is this work palatable?
So what if we were able to work without financial accountability, responsibility? What would that look like? Universal basic income, what would it look like if we were able to do that?
What if we could speak true all the time? What if we remember this moment and show a bit more compassion to our future selves and to other people? And what if Kat becomes a billionaire?
What if we abolish the term BAME and white people learn how to talk about race? What if there was mandatory reading and learning that happened for organizations around anti-racist practice, around radical reform, around accessibility? What if organizations had to prove or be accountable to a reading list and learning, and not just policies that are in files on a Dropbox? What if we moved to low ego and high impact? What if we were able to work with people and organizations built on aligned values rather than who can sell the most?
What if there were no theatres? What if there was no art subsidy at all in this country? What if we just let the theatre die? What if a theatre's revenue was solely based on what its local community was willing to contribute? What if there was no concept of a professional artist? What if theatre represented the voice of people? What if theatre actually had some political agency and gave a voice to those that don't currently have one?
What if we had universal basic income? What if artists had a place of work where they would be able to sift through the private matters alone or together and then surface when there was something to share? What if I resign? What if we all resigned? What if nobody was considered independent or divergent from the norm? What if people could come together because they didn't know what would happen, rather than because they know what would happen?
What if audiences knew that the piece didn't need to have a happy ending, but that's okay because we're all going to be in the bar afterwards and we're all going to have a dance floor to dance on together? What if I said to my neighbours, let's make a thing, and we made a thing and no one saw the thing, but that was really okay?
What if we all keep talking? And what if we all keep talking in the real world and we all meet at Arc and Umar makes us one of his extraordinary curries and we talk through the night? What if we all get much better at listening? What if we could all go back in time and actually experience each other's work in the real world? What if we publish these statements, or better still, perform them? What if we perform them to our communities, our families, to anyone who'll listen? What if we perform them in the House of Commons? What if we learn to value our practice? What if we learn to encourage others to value the arts?
What if venues were workers' co-ops? What if there were plentiful housing co-ops for artists? What if we all lived in a giant house? What if talking to people in power felt less scary? What if art was just free all of the time and it was everywhere? What if it was on our high streets and in our shops and on the radio and on stages and in car parks and online and in people's bedrooms and through people's post boxes and in the sky?
What if the working class felt they could support the arts like they support football?
What if we limited the amount of ballet, Shakespeare, and sport and reinvested and opera and reinvested that money in the rest of the arts? What if we spent the money from renewing Trident on the arts? What if we taxed the rich and used that money for the arts? What if Rupert Murdoch's daughter didn't work on the Arts Council? We really don't cost that much.
What if it was easier to imagine the end of capitalism rather than the end of the world? What if we spent more on the first year of someone's life rather than the last? What if we didn't give a penny to any individual or organization unless they could demonstrate they were anti-racist? What if we shared everything? What if we created more than we consumed? And what if Godzilla destroyed everything? What would we then rebuild?
What if I could keep this adopted family? If I could keep your voices in my head and your faces as well.
What if politicians were paid like artists are currently paid? What if money didn't exist as a concept? And what if the arts was ran entirely on a basis of exchange, of exchanging skills, of exchanging kindness? What if no theatres were ever again to allow... What if no theatres were allowed to put on a Shakespeare ever again? What would we fill the programme with if theatres were never allowed to put on a Shakespeare ever again? And what if, as a tangible starting point, we could make a manifesto that all artists and all theatre makers would sign and get behind and say that we would only work with theatres or venues or organisations if they are fully committed to accessibility, if they are really serious about their anti-racist action, if they have a set policy of care towards artists and towards their staff, if they were committed to ecological sustainability, if they had radical transparency so that we know who the money's going to and, importantly, where their money is coming from. And what if we could take all of the fear that we have as artists and as people existing in a state of constant precarity, and by doing this manifesto, turn that fear into a collective power?
What if the climate crisis hired the publicist for coronavirus? What if we woke up from the illusion of our separateness? What if we saw all experience as holy? What if visiting artists were a regular feature in a young person's education rather than an anomaly or a luxury to those schools that could afford it? What if deeply considering the lived experience of others was taught from primary school upwards in our educational experiences? What if the person in front of you is always the most significant? What if we stopped holding on to our perceived unworthiness? What if we started listening to understand rather than impatiently to reply? What if we looked at all of this not as a great weight on us, but part of a big dance? And what if we made friends with change?
What if we all have to do it rather than just say it?
What if we could get fisted on stage without a license? What if health and safety was a guideline rather than a necessity? And What if we were honest when someone says, "How are you?"
What if our resources and knowledge became truly communal? What if being a single artist and potentially a parent felt like they could happen?
What if there was no such thing as competition and collaboration was the thing instead?
What if conversations like this one and the conversations that we've been having for the past 2 weeks, these brilliant, organic, brave, fucking mad conversations that we've been having for the past 2 weeks, were compulsory listening for all venues and not just for the venues who wanted to show up? What if these conversations were compulsory to rattle the cages of the people who don't want to listen because they'll be fine because they run the National Theatre?
What if I what if I felt like what if I felt like this was the last conversation before the world changed? Does that make sense?
What if we truly believed that we could actually make a difference? And what if we stopped thinking about them and us?
What if I had enough rhubarb in the garden to make a rhubarb and ginger jam for all the artists and all the venue workers in this country? And what if we had an artist living with us every 6 months in our spare room?
What if I felt like I didn't have a shelf life? What if there was a venue that felt like home?
What if more commissioners and producers consider the possibility that artists might have caring responsibilities? What if after lockdown we continue to ask other people how they feel and to leave real space to listen to what they have to say?
Echoing Lady Kit and Brendan, what if we listen to the answer when we ask, "How are you?" And what if we're prepared to do something about the answer to that question? What if we continue to remember and say it to ourselves every morning when we get up, that pauses and silences are as valuable as the words between? What if together we say no? What if together we say yes? What if we are brave?
What if we always started where we are and not where we wish we were? What if we considered our learning never to be complete? What if our lives were evaluated by our presence rather than our productivity? And what if, based on what Kat just said, what if artists could move into people's houses? People could rent them, like a paint, rather than a painting, an Arts Council painting scheme, or a Netflix kind of box set. You could actually like rent an artist for a week to like go straight in like a Exocet missile, and just I think that'd be really cool. I'm quite excited by that one. You can tell my voice changed.
What if theatre was a community resource? What if there was no more YouTube or Facebook or Vimeo? What if companies had to have at least half of their board made up of under 25-year-olds? What if we changed the time that we look at art or think about theatre? What if multinationals had to make lunchtime theatre part of their everyday practice for every single employee? What if the work that's programmed for the studio occasionally made it onto the main stage?
What if we valued people over buildings, ideas over products? What if we wrote a new constitution for every city in the UK? And what if someone on this conversation actually created a hoverboard? What then?
What if we only made art for 6 months of the year, but there was universal basic income, so we could spend the other 6 thinking and dreaming? What if we committed to having safer spaces and braver spaces rather than just safe spaces? What if all R&Ds could be done outside of the space that a venue or organisation provide? What if Tony didn't drop her phone while she was trying to do this? What if we recognise that care is a survival strategy? What if we thought about radical change, real radical change? What if we stopped pretending like anti-racist work, that work that centres disabled people, that changing things and structures is not tiresome and sweaty? What if we acknowledge that change is hard, but that it's necessary? What if every building had a space to nap in?
What if we unapologetically eradicate imposter syndrome? What if we started valuing ourselves? What if you remember me and I remember you? And just the other thing I'm going to say is that the artists know this already, right? However, I've just had my first national audition, okay? And it's for fucking Shakespeare. So any of you fuckers eradicate Shakespeare or national before I get in there, I'm going to find you and I'm going to hunt you down. I'm going to tell my bloody cousins from Afghanistan to come. What if?
What if this was just the beginning?
Yeah.
What if we can make it happen?